Welcome to the 86th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. I'm Max Rudolph, and today my partner Dave Ingram and I will share what we've learned during our careers about implementing an enterprise risk management program. We'll share a few stories to expand on the basic concepts. Most of our experience is with financial firms, but these concepts can be used to get started in all types of entities. Please share with those interested in lifelong learning about risk management. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We are here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds. Let's get started. So you can't start talking about enterprise risk management without having a definition of it. Risk can be defined in several ways, and uncertainty about an unknown future plays a part. Many prefer a statistical volatility metric or look only at downside risk or shortfalls against goals. I tend to look at a combination of these, and you need to be aware of how your audience thinks about risk too. Risk exposure aggregates these metrics so they can be managed individually. Risk management considers ways that the risk owner can choose to navigate a risk. An entity can exploit, manage, minimize, or avoid risk exposures as a form of silo risk management. Note that I tend to use the word entity because it is broader than firm. I find that many of these concepts applicable even to individuals and have written up similarities to individual investment strategies in the past. Enterprise risk management, or ERM, considers interactions between risks and how they aggregate. A decision that makes sense for one business unit may not make sense for the firm, and the risk team is often involved in setting up consistent metrics and processes so capital allocation has consistency between opportunities and decision sets. Risk and return must be balanced. Some call ERM enterprise risk and return management, ERRM, alluding to the strategic opportunities and moving beyond purely defensive methods and constraints. Many risk organizations have a definition of ERM. One I like and was involved with adopting comes from the actuarial profession. It was developed by the Casualty Actuarial Society and then later adopted by the Society of Actuaries. The discipline by which an organization in any industry assesses, controls, exploits, finances, and monitors risk from all sources for the purpose of increasing the organization's short and long-term value to its shareholders. That's a pretty complete definition. If your ERM program is going to influence decision-making at the senior level, it's important to include exploit in your definition. This differentiates an ERM definition from pure downside concerns to being involved in strategic planning.
I think of risk management consistent with Max's definition, but I think of it in three layers, actually. At one layer is where the company is managing individual risks, and at a second layer is where the company is managing its aggregation of risks. And then the third layer is where the company is managing what Max was talking about with the risk and reward management. And what I've found from looking at a lot of companies is that some companies operate only one or two of those three layers. The risk management system usually operates within a cycle. And what that means is that there's a number of steps that take place, and usually they're repeated year after year, hence the cycle idea. And in that cycle, we start out usually with identifying risks. The first time you do that, that's quite a time-consuming activity. It takes at least a half a day to get through that process the first time. The second step in the cycle is assessing the risk, getting some sense of how all these different metrics that Max just mentioned might apply to the risk, and looking at how the different risks that the company's exposed to compare to each other, and how they actually add to each other or diversify each other. The next step in the control cycle is to set a plan for each of the risks. And since mostly the risks are there because of the business activities, the risk plan and the business plan are extremely tightly linked together. When you look at the amount of risk that you would expect to accumulate because of executing your business plan, that's your risk. That's why I think of that as your risk target. But then you also want to think of, well, what happens if the company has additional opportunities or has a chance to or considers doing something that is on the average riskier than what was in the original plan. You want to set some limits on that for each individual business. The next step in the risk control cycle is taking the risks, and in that process, you may have a risk selection step where which is generally called underwriting for insurance risks and credit risk. Once you've taken the risk, you might want to do some mitigation to risks. Some risks you just take and you hold until they play out. Other risks you take and you modify them immediately through a mitigation. We'll talk more about that later. And then a further step in the risk control cycle is measuring and monitoring each of the risks. And again, we'll have a lengthier discussion on that. And then based on what you learn from taking the risks, mitigating them, measuring and monitoring what's left, then you want to have a step where you respond to that information and make adjustments to your plan, make adjustments to what you'll do during the rest of the planning period uh, to, uh, to make sure that you're getting what you want in terms of both risk and reward.
The first part of Dave's, what he just described as the risk control cycle, is risk identification and assessment. I find it useful to set up categories for risks to sort them so you don't just have one list of a huge number of risks. For example, some sample insurance risks might be called operational, liquidity and market, credit, insurance, or underwriting. Some include strategic here, but it seems redundant to me. What isn't a strategic risk? Then you get into risks with multiple categories because everything's strategic, so it's strategic and something else. It seems cleaner if very few risks are in more than one category, but there's certainly other opinions on that. Financial risks can often be modeled and often are compared to a market price. Operational risks can be modeled but are rarely traded. Strategic risk, if modeled, I don't think it has a consensus value. Each person's assumptions will vary, and so the intrinsic value that you come up with there is going to be different too. Operational risks are the primary driver for non-financial firms. Safety, security, many of these things are where you buy insurance to protect yourself financially, at least from some of these risks, although the reputation risk remains. Think about a chemical company. Internal controls and metrics will vary from those that are purely financial to include deaths and injuries, cyber events, hiring practices. Many of these are still important for financial firms like banks, hedge funds, and insurers, but it just shows to how the risks are really different in the way people think about running businesses that are non-financial as their primary risk. One thing you don't want to do is to allow a risk owner to also measure their exposures without independent review. You really need that first, what they call the first line of defense is the people who price a product, and then the second line of defense is the people who review it. I do want to highlight the importance of liquidity. Ernest Hemingway very famously said in The Sun Also Rises about ways to go bankrupt. And he says two ways: gradually, then suddenly. Risks grow in the dark, and then they suddenly are illuminated. Those with high leverage are impacted the most as conditions surprise the masses. Access to cash and its equivalents is the difference between success and failure oftentimes. Having a grasp of your business, its risk exposures, and stress testing that includes leverage can get you a qualitative understanding of your exposure to risk fairly easily. A list of risk, often called a risk taxonomy, is not very useful unless you assess and prioritize them. I can't work on everything at the same time. You need to decide which are the most important to address it at the current time. Keep in mind that risks need to be aligned, and so the company level top risks need to have plans all the way down to the department levels, business lines, things like that. And they need to be consistent within an entity so that they can be aggregated. We need to find a couple ways that we use to prioritize. We'll talk about frequency, how likely something is to happen. It's based on the probability of that occurrence, of that risk event. Severity, how bad will it be? Velocity is one that we talk about sometimes. How quickly will the risk appear? For example, an earthquake or hurricane goes from zero to too late to react very quickly, while a firm with their home office in Norfolk, Virginia, has time to prepare for the sea level rise that's coming. And they already are, by the way. Estimate frequency, severity, and velocity using a metric that combines them into a heat map that allows you to compare uh, against other risks. And then you can kind of come up with tiers when you're ranking them in terms of almost a red, yellow, green. Which ones are you not that worried about? Which ones are, you kind of monitoring, and which ones you absolutely need to be working on right now. Buy-in is improved by involving risk owners, but they need a little bit of oversight for consistency. And what I've seen when I've worked with companies is that some teams view the risks that they own as being the most important things because that's what they work on all day. And so they'll identify all their risks as 5 out of 5. And so you don't want that. You need to have some consistency between the setters of the rankings. I want to talk a little bit about time horizon. I look at three different time horizons when I'm looking at risks. I have an immediate, sometimes I'll call that the fire time horizon, things that need to be dealt with immediately. Best example of this from my background is, I was working with a company and they were moving buildings. Their entire home office was going to move within the next year. That's in that immediate time horizon. Your tactical 3 to 5 years, that's your normal business planning, and then strategic over 5 years. And you need to rank these so that there's a way that forces you to work on all three different time horizons, or you tend to lose yourself in what is due tomorrow. You only work on the immediate risks. Assumptions should cover an entire cycle when you're modeling. That's another important thing. For example, credit risk should not use historical experience and let it unless it all includes and covers a downturn that had defaults. You want to consider trends. So like wildfires are increasing, and so property risk is increasing in those areas where wildfire is common. And this is what I've talked about before as my unknown knowns category, where historical data is not predictive. So that can be helpful as you're looking at trying to prioritize some of these risks. One risk that does cross asset and liability cash flows and so ends up oftentimes in more than one category is asset liability management, or ALM. Most risks are limited to either assets or liabilities, but a mismatch between the asset and liability cash flows is the same as adding debt. It incorporates leverage in the results. For example, if I have a long product like a pension risk transfer line of business, I can't invest long enough to match the cash flows. If rates fall uh, on a permanent basis, I'm going to lose. I have a risk that future economic growth will be reduced and interest rate trends permanently fall. Um, I've done work before, and we know that expectations led by demographics are leading towards a slower growth economy in the future. So this risk, I think, should be setting off your spider senses today. Where you have a long liability, you have reinvestment risk, and so the likelihood that you're going to earn the rate that you earned initially on those later investments is certainly well below 100%. Emerging risks are a favorite topic for me over the last 20 years, and they can include new or evolving risks, higher uncertainty, including risks to be aware of over a longer time horizon, and it helps to prioritize. You want to focus on risks that are emerging risks that are low frequency and high severity outcomes. Those are the ones that matter. Expanding on what I said a minute ago, have you guaranteed prices beyond the risk event's arrival? For example, Do you have residential mortgage loan exposure or commercial loan exposure in an area subject to sea level rise and used it to back a long duration product? A 30-year mortgage that's issued today in Miami, I think it's really unlikely that it's going to make it to the end of its lifetime without a default. So you need to be thinking about that as well. Some examples of emerging risks would include cyber risk, climate, terrorism. You want to be aware of asset bubbles and liability pricing errors. Those can be in there as well. Artificial intelligence, and Dave may want to add to this part. It's good for many things, but identifying tail events in advance is probably not on the list of things it's designed for. Working with a human who can provide foresight, I think really improves that process. Not to ignore AI in this process, but to work with AI. And there's a broad range of risk identification practices that I've seen. I saw one company that told me they had 60,000 risks. Well, they didn't really have that many. They just had 30 risks, but they listed them for every department. And so instead of saying they had 30 risks, they said they had 30 times the number of departments times lines of business and things like that. So make sure you get some consistency there. Perfect is the enemy of the good. And you really want to involve management for buy-in and accountability.
The next area that we want to focus on is risk measurement that allows us to do our risk reporting. And I like to think of risk measurements as falling into four categories, where one is a factor method, a second is stress testing, the third is historical, and the fourth is a statistical model. And let me go over those real quick and explain what I mean by that. The factor models are popular and were the original capital metrics that were used by the originally first the rating agencies and then shortly thereafter the regulators, particularly in the U.S., started doing that. And the factor method is an amount of a loss usually that has been calculated for risk with the assumption that with higher or lower volume of activity for that risk, you'll get higher or lower losses. So it's assuming that whatever average loss you had per unit of activity stays constant. Um, Stress tests are another method there where what you're doing is you're imagining an adverse situation and then determining what the loss for a particular risk might be under that situation. I like to separate those situations into three categories that I call normal volatility, realistic disaster, and worst case, where normal volatility is more or less plus or minus one standard deviation. So that's the normal volatility measure that a lot of folks use for risk. The second, the realistic disaster, is more like what you're seeing with an RBC measure or something like that. It's and I like to tell folks that are not particularly numerically oriented on this that a realistic disaster is once in your business career kind of a loss. And then a worst case loss is something that's much worse than that. Uh, I don't necessarily specify how much worse because I think that we really don't know frequencies out past a certain return period. And so saying it's a one in 150 or a one in 200, I don't think we know how to tell the difference between those. Um, but anyway, the normal volatility risks level is probably what's management's highest concern. Those are usually earnings hits, those kind of losses. Whereas a realistic disaster is more likely the board's concern. Those are things that could put a stop to the company potentially, and that's really what you want to find out is, do I have any risks lurking about that are that way? The worst case are concerns usually of the regulator. Historical worst events is where you've just taken your own history and said, well, what was the worst thing that ever happened to me relating to this, and then adjusting that according to the differences both in the amount of activity that you're doing now compared to the historical period, and also other major differences in the world. For example, if you wanted to look at the 1918 flu pandemic and say what would that be like if it happened today? Well, medicine's a lot different today than it was in 1918, so you'd want to adjust for that, in addition to adjusting for volume differences. And then there's the statistical models. And with the statistical models, we usually use a statistical metric that we're looking at, value at risk, which is usually the loss at a particular percentile when you've taken the outcome of a stochastic model and ranked all the scenarios. Conditional tail expectation is the average loss that's above some percentile. And those are the two most popular tail risk measures. And usually a company might adopt one or the other of those as their economic capital measure. And then in some cases, particularly under Solvency II, the regulator specifies that you should be using that kind of a model. Or in the US, the regulator uses the factor method, as we mentioned earlier. One of the biggest advantages, I think, to enterprise risk management is the idea that you will use consistent risk measures across all your departments. That was probably my first activity related to risk management, was developing a risk formula, a risk capital formula for the company I worked for that was as consistent as we could imagine at that time, for all the different business units. And that was a first for that company. And that's the end of part one of our discussion of implementing an ERM program. Key takeaways for today include: first, ERM balances both strategic upside and pure downside concerns. That means incorporating the concept of exploiting risk allows a senior level ERM program to differentiate itself from simple downside worries and actively contribute to strategic planning and capital allocation. Second, a disciplined risk control cycle operates year after year. This multi-step cycle loops through 5 critical phases: identification and assessment, setting targets and limits, accepting and mitigating risks, measuring and monitoring risks, and reacting to experiences. Third, effective risk prioritization is a key part of risk identification. It combines frequency, severity, and velocity. Fourth, human foresight is vital for identifying and assessing emerging and tail risks. And last, risk measurement relies on 4 core methodologies: factor methods, stress testing, historical events, and statistical models. In our next podcast, we'll finish up our walk through the basics of implementing an ERM program with discussions of risk reporting to senior leadership, risk appetite and tolerance, supporting strategic decision making, building the ERM program over time, how the CRO needs to position the risk function as a helper to business units and avoid becoming known as Dr. No. We hope you have enjoyed this edition of Crossing Thin Ice, and we hope that you plan to listen to us next time. Thanks. Bye.